Hello, today I am reviewing the Marloe Mansions Murders by Adam Gordon MacLeod, and if that's a name that suggests to you there can be only one, well, I decided to read this book after a meeting with the good man's son, himself a national hero. And should Mr. MacLeod happen upon this video or a member of his family, then I can only say, hello sir, I hope you are doing very well, thank you for your service. Now the book itself actually begins with a rather unusual dedication. To the reader who reads or skips but does not dip, and to the reviewer who slates or praises but does not disclose the plot, this book is humbly dedicated. Well, let's get on with disclosing the plot. Robert Burrill, Bobby to his multitude of friends, and his uncle Bill, aka Sir William, are on their way to purchase a valuable stamp collection from one Ganthony Slyne, a fairly odious character, who is in the process of blackmailing a young lady and ends up on the bad side of dead. Sir William, discovering the body, calls in his contacts at Scotland Yard to investigate. Sir William has an extensive history of crime detection, and the official detectives request his assistance. There is, in the biography MacLeod presents us, the hint that MacLeod's other books may cover the further adventures of Bobby and Bill. But of course you remember him now, the Inspector Burrill who came into prominence in the affair of the Maharaja of Gound, and later as Chief Inspector and Superintendent successively, established and enhanced his reputation by his masterly handling of many of the most intricate cases of the first decade of this century. Information on this on the internet is actually quite limited, but it certainly does seem that that's the case. These books do seem to be part of a series, yet I don't really know if this is the first, last, or even a middle effort. Who killed Ganthony Slyne, why, and how develops from a prologue that seems to explain those things into something of a genuine mystery, a mystery that deepens by the minute as the police and Sir William begin their investigation. After a further murder comes to light, Sir William's inquiry methodically sets about looking into each and every lead in turn and unravelling that mystery. And this is a murder mystery, so I will be discussing these as I usually do, and that may mean some spoilers ahead, but I will try to give you warning to avoid them. Sir William's investigation is so methodical that some things are discounted or dismissed as they go along. This robs proceedings of a Poirot-like reveal and a generally enthralling or surprising reveal that ties up the plot in the denouement, but generally MacLeod's offering satisfies. Bobby's unlikely infatuation with the suspicion-shrouded damsel Pamela could possibly derail a more stuffy or stiff-backed offering, but Bobby is already established as a big softy by being roped into seeing two different youngsters across the road, and by MacLeod's prose that tells us that the easiest way to stir his sympathies is to look like you need his help. To be in trouble was to find your way straight to Bobby's heart. Of course, her slender feminine figure and her sad eyes, tear-stained eyes, frightened eyes, they probably help as well. Bobby is an unofficial policeman with no portfolio, of course. He's simply his uncle's occasional assistant and nothing official, and therefore he drifts in and out of the story. But for me, he was key to the text because with no exposure to MacLeod's work and little in this genre beyond Arthur Conan Doyle, and nothing really from those between war years I mentioned, I didn't really know what to expect from the book. My copy is pre-loved, and Bobby's frequent exclamation, "Good Lord," was underlined in each instance by its previous owner, and those instances were numerous. However, it isn't long before this catchphrase is identifiable as such, and the narrator starts to have a little fun with it. For several seconds the two stared at it in silence, then from Bobby came the inevitable "Good Lord." And MacLeod pokes affectionate fun at his amorous protagonist and his oft-repeated slogan throughout. Good Lord! This was, of course, Bobby. In fact, MacLeod's narrator is an engaging and occasionally amusing one, in tone somewhat Victorian. In fact, there can be no greater compliment than to suggest a comparison, if somewhat slight, to Dickens. This passage, the beginning of the introduction to both Sir William and Bobby, has all the Dickens hallmarks. The narrator is obtrusively communicating directly with his audience, a dated technique, not necessarily everyone's cup of tea perhaps. The taxi swerved to the curb and pulled up. While its occupants alight, let us take the opportunity afforded by the light streaming from the doorway to examine them, for in the ensuing pages we shall find ourselves frequently in their company. And as we've seen with Bobby, the narrator likes to make the odd wry interjection and bring a touch of light-heartedness to proceedings. Sometimes this isn't entirely to the text's benefit. Bobby, we learn, has lost an eye in gallant action during the war, and while much is made of Sir William's many qualifications, MacLeod tells us that in Bobby's case, only 3 letters figure after his name, the 4th, 19th and 15th of the alphabet, but Bobby has no reason to be ashamed of their fewness. Now honestly, if you know what that spells without the aid of looking it up, or you can work it out in your head, I tip my hat to you. It's the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, a medal for wartime bravery. It seems perhaps MacLeod could have just said that. It almost makes light of what's a pretty serious thing there, I think. But perhaps in this post-war era, veterans were not respected as they are now. It's a minor thing. And here comes the spoiler, so skip ahead if you want to. But the most obvious example of the consistent light tone of the novel not being quite right is after the murder of Ellershaw, a figure liked and respected by Sir William, but he never quite breaks his know-it-all tone to give the death its due significance or even really any emotional resonance. Welcome back. In 1928, there were certainly some other remnants of Victorian attitudes, particularly demonstrated with the working or lower classes having their dialogue presented phonetically as in these examples. None of which, of course, is particularly difficult to decipher, nor is it a convention that doesn't occasionally appear in more modern times. The Victorians also often associated criminality with physical ugliness, malformation or stupidity, a convention which was occasionally subverted even in his own time. Here MacLeod has little fun with it. He plays up one of the book's villains, known as the Slug, as rather cartoonishly ugly, physically disfigured and stupid. Comparing at once his simian forebears and philosophers, his simian features bore a look of considerable disgruntlement, for the Slug was meditating on that old theme, the vagaries of human existence, and, like other philosophers, found it unsatisfactory, complicated, puzzling. And Pamela would fall as easily into the Victorian period as she does into a feint, though with a caveat that is also a spoiler, so skip to the timestamp again to avoid this one. In pursuit of the payoff for his crimes, the Slug attempts to rob Pamela. He reckons without Bobby's pistol and Pamela's previously unforeseen resourcefulness. Put 'em up. Pamela hardly recognised the voice that snapped out the words, though she had a dim memory of the film caption from which she had borrowed them. They seemed to her appropriate. Here again we get a taste of that sardonic wit from MacLeod when he adds, "To the Slug they seemed equally so, his hands shot up," thus proving that even a Wild West film may have its educational value. The tone and the theme continues when the Slug reverses the roles. "Put 'em up," he snarled, plagiarising the same caption writer as Pamela. It's a well-executed scene in exchange, and reinforces that for all the Slug's cartoonish villain cliches, including the odd "gore blimey," the brain behind it all recognises them as just that, and is more than prepared to poke fun at them. While Pamela, and particularly the fact that the men in question forget her presence entirely in the scene, she's key to the successful resolution of the standoff. But to truly reject the Victorian attitudes he plays with, MacLeod would have to let Pamela get through the scene without fainting, and he doesn't. It's interesting, though, that against this backdrop, MacLeod describes Victoriana as being ghastly, suggesting that the fashions of the era were outdated in 1928 when the book came out, even while some of the attitudes remained. The novel's narrator, as mentioned, directly appeals to the audience at times, is generally of a jovial tone and quite prepared to have some fun with his characters, situations and the conventions of the genre. It is a narrative voice that, despite similarities to some of its predecessors, is something quite close to unique. MacLeod certainly enjoys punctuation, as shown here, to a level that I've not seen anywhere else, but it is these frequent exclamation marks that help demonstrate to those unfamiliar with his work, like me, that this has something of a parody about it. Occasionally you come across a fictional character whose adventures are entertaining, but you wonder how insufferable they might actually be in real life. One such figure for me is Sherlock Holmes, and it's something that I did keep coming back to when I was reading this. Sir William certainly has that same know-it-all energy about him, and like Doyle, MacLeod injects enough levity into his text that his lead never becomes annoying despite his detecting and deductive superpowers, all the way that he frequently stalls the goings-on by refusing to divulge information he has. Sometimes you can't help wonder how many police man-hours he wastes in that way, but the plot has enough going on and the narrator is warm and engaging enough that it never grates in the way that it might if there was a more serious tone. And ultimately the success of a novel in overcoming the smattering of pieces that might stall a lesser writer is that MacLeod, when he needs to shift the tone, he manages it adroitly, such as in this effort when the detective Ellershaw is suddenly discovered missing from a room with no method of egress. Silence brooded over the flat, a strange, sinister silence that to the strained senses of the two listeners seemed suddenly filled with faint mocking echoes. Against that, we have to also include an example of MacLeod's love of punctuation from the same scene. But it's still a very effective description, utilising sibilants and this poetic echo of fricatives that resonate in this brooding, mocking silence. By all means pause this one because it's long enough that I won't read it, but in this scene Pamela is woken by the slug breaking into the flat, and the way MacLeod fragments his text is something of a lesson in how to amp up tension, particularly towards the end of the section. For all the joviality he offers in the rest of the text, MacLeod here injects a sudden pace of tension that's more powerful for its incongruity with that usual tone that elevates this novel above mere parody. Compare that to this one, again, the pause button is your friend, where he introduces Mrs. Farrar to the case and searches for a suitable nautical entity to compare her with, and discusses the merits of the very literary technique involved, and even takes the opportunity to poke fun at his character's overused catchphrase. This is MacLeod at his most Dickens, a comparison that few writers come out of looking well. Now, obviously MacLeod is no Dickens, I'm not claiming that, nor is his detective tale as cerebral or as impactful or surprising as some other offerings, but I think that his take on the genre is more light-hearted than Doyle's, and that makes it just as enjoyable, if not more so. And now that is quite a compliment. I have no hesitation in recommending this book if you can track down a copy. Hopefully MacLeod will experience some sort of upsurge in popularity soon that will make his body of work more easy to track down. If you can deal with the novel punctuation, then this book has a lot about it to make it worth your while. Particularly the way MacLeod so expertly changes mood when Pamela is threatened, and it makes that first spoiler that I mentioned and won't mention here obviously, the novel's only real misstep. If we then return to the novel's opening dedication, despite disclosing some of the plot, I am firmly in the praising camp. I recommend this book to you and I hope that you check it out. In the meantime, thank you for watching this review and for visiting the channel. By all means check out some of our other videos and things that we have available to you, and if you subscribe and ring the bell, then YouTube will notify you when I next upload something.